This is Friday, the 25th of January, 1991.
You pick me up, okay?
Yeah. This is a real good machine that does a good job. Okay.
Janie,
Yes?
they're ready to start another hearing.
Charles is going to do that.
Okay, all by himself?
Yes, I'm doing them this afternoon.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, this is Representative Jayne Aylward. And Jane, when did you serve in the Kansas House? From what years to what years?
I was first elected in 1978.
Please come to the front, Charles.
So my first term began in January 1989, or pardon me, 1979.
1970.
Right, 1979, and I served through May 23rd of 1990 when I resigned to take on the state board.
Okay,
tax
that's
appeals.
3 terms then.
No, we had two-year terms.
Two-year, that's right. 6?
6 terms.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. And you're a Republican, and can you just kind of give me a little background, or why did you ever affiliate with the Republican Party in the first place, and how long have you been a Republican?
Well, I've been a Republican all my life, which was fairly short before I was elected to the legislature. I was fortunate enough to win the primary election when I was 21 years old, and then was elected when I was 22. So really the fact that I was a Republican at that point, and that's changed over time, but at that point was probably based on the fact that my parents were.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in a Republican household, and frankly my parents were Republicans because years ago, and I can't even tell you one, I think back in the 50s, I had an uncle, my mother's sister's husband, Joe Crowther, who was in the legislature a term. And when he ran, he had a primary. And my parents had been Irish Catholic Democrats. You know, my father's ancestors came out on the railroad and all that. But Joe was a Republican, and he had a primary, and they switched parties to vote for him.
Oh, interesting.
So my parents were Republicans the entire time I was growing up. And at the time that I filed, were precinct committee people with the Republican Party. So that's, you know, I'd like to say there was some grander reason. That's probably why I started where I did.
It sounds like a real common reason. I mean, a lot of people have that same background. Okay, when you were first elected, can you describe your first election and why you decided to run, and what were the circumstances surrounding that decision and the people surrounding it?
Well, and that's a question I get asked a lot because I was so young, and I always wish I had a grander answer, but the truth is, I had graduated from college with a degree in animal science in May, and had decided that I wanted to be involved in our farming livestock operation. I love the cattle and still do, still have cattle, and hopefully always will be able to. But I got out to the farm, and of course I just graduated from college, so I was living with my parents, and found that living with your family and working with your family day after day after day, I needed a little variety in my life. And my father had always been active, not in local politics, but as I had said earlier, they were precinct committee people, and my dad had been on a lot of planning and zoning commissions and chairman of the parochial school board right around the school and that sort of thing. So he'd done things like that. At that time, my state representative was a gentleman named John Carlin. And John Carlin decided to run for governor. And my father belonged to a group called the Saline County Taxpayers Association. In fact, I think he was treasurer. And they had become a little bit disenchanted with state government and that sort of thing, and were looking for a candidate to run. And my dad, I know, went to several meetings to talk about, you know, who they could talk into to running for the legislature. And always came home kind of empty-handed because, you know, such and such either didn't have time or whatever the reason would be, they couldn't find a good candidate. By then, a couple of people had filed, and I kind of watched that and thought, well, you know, gee, if they could do that, I could. And I'll never forget the day. My folks have a ranch-style home, and my bedroom was in the basement, and I still remember the bathrobe I had on. My dad and I always got up in the morning early before anybody else did, and we'd visit. We're kind of early morning people, and we'd talk about the issues of the day before we went outside. And I remember coming upstairs one morning in this green bathrobe that I remember very well and saying, you know, Daddy, I think I found a candidate for you. And he said, well, who's that? And I said, I'm going to run. And after I scraped him up off the floor and stood him back up, you know, we really discussed it. And I said, well, the fact is, if I don't get elected, people around here will know that I'm interested in being involved in other things. So maybe I can get involved in Farm Bureau and some of those kinds of things, and they'll know I'm here. And if I do get elected, great, you know. So I ended up with there were 3 of us on the Republican tickets. There was a 3-way primary, and there were 2 Democrats that ran, so there were 5 candidates. But worked real hard and went out and saw everybody. I think I drove them all to distraction. They finally decided they'd vote for me if I'd stay out of their front yard, and won the election.
For Pete's sakes. Well, was there anyone encouraging you? Who would you say who worked for you and who advised you and that sort of thing during the decision time and the actual election?
Okay, and I'm not one of those
Campaigning.
people that came out and really got heavily recruited. And being in a Republican primary, you were fairly well on your own. But some things that I do recall, a fellow named Ben Vidrickson was chairman of the Saline County Republican Party, and as you know, Ben's a senator from there now. Ben wasn't in the Senate at the time, but my folks knew him since they were on the Central Committee. And the Smoky Hill River Festival was going on, and Ben, you know, has a restaurant barbecue deal, and we decided I needed to go over and visit with him. So I went over and tapped on the back door of his little trailer that he was serving stuff out of at the Smoky Hill River Festival, and here came Ben with his apron on, as you still see him a lot, serving things. And I visited with him, and I think Ben, maybe, he's never told me this, but I've always suspected he was a little skeptical at the time because he had this kid standing there that was all hot on running for the legislature, but he encouraged me. And then the person that I give the credit for really, really helping me in that election, and truly I don't believe we could have done it without him, is Morris K. Morris K. was chairman of the Republican Party at the time, and he came out and spent hours and hours, and I guess just decided that I was a candidate that could win. You know, my family had been there forever, and I'd been in 4-H in that community, and people knew us, and we were farmers like the district, and Morris really worked with me on what I needed to do. In fact, I remember Morris coming out and visiting with me and saying, Janie, now the first thing you need to do is go talk to the influential people in the community before you file and see what kind of response you get from them. And he had me make a list of the 100 people in Salina or Saline County, the area, that I thought had some influence. And what I didn't realize at the time, and he didn't tell me, he knew darn well what he was doing, is that I was fundraising. So I went in and visited with all those people and, you know, got them sort of brought around to my side before I ever filed, and it gave me some encouragement and confidence. And of course then I had set that base, and then Morris would come out again and say, now we're going to put your brochures together, and what you're going to do is go back to those 100 people and say, I need some money.
Oh, for Pete's sake.
And he provided an awful lot of encouragement and help.
Well, did you go door to door then, pretty much, or what style of campaigning did you carry out?
That's absolutely the style I carry out. In fact, I think we kind of started a new trend. I know you're from the farm, so you're probably familiar with the Farm Bureau township maps that you get. I could have never won elections without Farm Bureau's township maps because my district was basically a rural district. And I'd go through the voter registrations and mark off which houses had registered people and what party they were and all that kind of stuff. The first election before the primary, I don't think there was a Republican household we didn't go to. And then we went back around and we drove door to door out in the country. You know, my mother and I probably have spent more time together than any mother-daughter team in the country. We fought off more dogs together. But my mother was always my driver out in the rural areas. And we just take days and say, okay, this is the day for Elm Creek Township. And we'd start in the morning and go to Elm Creek Township and drive to every house we could drive to.
Well, did you have other people going door to door besides yourself and your mother? Or?
The first time, no. I thought it was very important that people get to know me. we covered, I honestly, I'm sure that there's a house somewhere that we missed, but our aim and goal, and I believe we accomplished the goal, was to hit every house
It's a
in the
lot of
district.
households, yeah.
So, and that's how I always ran
Did you?
campaigns. And I've noticed everybody that's run against me has made some stab at that, but the fact is it requires a heck of a lot of time.
Mm-hmm.
And being in the farming business, I could arrange things to do that. A lot of people simply
Yeah.
can't. And I think the ultimate way to win an election is to beat everybody's door.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I don't think anything will change my mind on that.
Yeah. Well, now you just had small hometown newspapers mostly, but did the media play any part in your campaign? Did you advertise in the media, either newspaper, radio, or TV, or?
Yes, I did. We had, actually, my district didn't take in most of the city of Salina. It was reapportioned during my tenure, so when I started out, I had Ellsworth and Saline County rural areas and a little bit of the city. Then I switched over, and most of the time I served Dickinson County and rural Saline County and part of the city. And now it's reapportioned back, and it's back to where it was when I started with Ellsworth County. But I did use the media to a degree. I ran ads in the small town papers, used radio.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe the first time I did all the radio ads myself.
Did you?
Later on, I ended up having people do some endorsement kind of ads
Mhm.
on specific issues. You know, when you're an incumbent, you've got a record, people
Mhm.
pick on things.
Yes.
If you're getting nailed on a farming issue, you go find a farmer everybody in the county knows and get them to do an ad
Mhm.
for you. And I did use newspapers some. Now, being in the Salina area, we did have a cable TV station there, and I did some ads with it when they were doing that sort of local thing. They don't anymore. And I bought ads in the bigger newspaper, which was a Salina Journal, but you know their circulation goes clear out to the Colorado border, and they're darn expansive,
yeah.
so you don't buy a whole lot more than you have to.
Huh. Well, who were your opponents in your first election? You said there were 5 of you. There were 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats. Who did you end up running against? And how
It was an
close was it?
interesting race. And I'm not good at, I guess those statistics aren't real important to me because I don't remember the vote split. I believe it was about 60-40 the first time.
Wow.
And it was an interesting race. The newspaper, in fact, gave us some free publicity because I was young and, of course, I'm blonde. My opponent was a year older than I was, and he was blonde, the fellow that won the primary, so they called it the Barbie and Ken doll race. And there was a newspaper article with our pictures together with the Barbie and Ken doll race. And fortunately, he was in law school and going back and forth to Washburn, so he didn't have the time to campaign that I did, but was much more politically astute because his father was chairman of the Democrat Party locally, and I think they had intended with John Carlin, the Democrat, going out that he would walk right in. But that was the kind of opponent that I had, and at that time it was probably very fortunate because I was so young that they couldn't use it against me because he was too.
Well, that's interesting.
Although in the primary election now, one of my opponents was a pretty well-known farmer, and age probably played the other way on him because he was up in his 70s and didn't get around as well. And my other opponent in the primary was a fellow that lived out in Ellsworth County away from the population base. So it
Well, that's
just worked out
interesting.
okay.
Yeah, it's kind of a strange, unusual circumstance. How about your other elections? And did you have any uncontested years, or were they all pretty hard? Did you?
Oh, it was nice. Yeah, I did have one year where I didn't have an opponent, but considering that the district was John Carlin's district before, it was one that the Democrats always envisioned they could get. So I generally was opposed.
In the general election.
In the general election, I never did have another primary.
Oh.
I didn't have a primary
Well,
after that.
That's great. Yeah.
But I always had a general, except I believe in 1980, it was 84 or 86. I escaped and didn't have a general election. And, now I know why people want to be in the Senate. If there's no other reason, it's for the 4-year terms.
Yeah.
That was really nice. And I had some tough opponents, and then I had some where, but the fact is, Barbara, fact, they used to joke with me down here because I am so paranoid when it comes to elections. I'd be on the phone every day saying, I'm going to get beat, I'm going to get beat, I know I'm going to lose. Because that was always my attitude, and that kept me going to work harder so that I'd win.
Oh, that's interesting, yeah. Well, then you felt very competitive, and you were willing to really put forth a lot of energy and time to be elected. And would you say that's very important to us?
Absolutely. I think that's the most important, getting to know the people.
Well, did John Carlin work against you? Did he endorse your opponent in that first election? And then
I don't recall that he came out and endorsed him, and I don't know why. I've never talked to him about that. I would assume probably he was running for governor, and he was probably so tied up in his own race that he just didn't have time to fool around in the other ones.
And he didn't then 2 years later either, huh?
You know, I never really noticed that there was any involvement.
That's interesting.
You know, I always expected it, but I didn't ever see any tracks of any involvement.
Well, your district then did change slightly. I mean, you were redistricted once, weren't you?
As a matter of fact, I had some major redistricting. I got elected in a district that was all of Ellsworth County and all of rural Saline County and the very north end of the city of Salina. The next year that I ran in 1980, the district had been reapportioned because, of course, the federal government requires that every 10 years. I had lost all of Ellsworth County.
Oh, my goodness.
Picked up about 2/3 of Dickinson County, clear over and took in Harrington, which is an old railroad hub town, pretty Democrat area for a Republican. That was kind of scary. And picked up Solomon, the city of Solomon in Dickinson County, which is another Irish Catholic Democrat area. But what they didn't know when they did that, well, the Republicans knew it because I told them Solomon was okay. They kept looking at the voter registration saying, gosh, Jayne, can you survive that one? And I said, Solomon's okay because that's where my dad grew up.
Oh.
So we had a lot of ties with the Solomon area. And then I kept all of rural Saline County, but instead of the north end of Salina, then they came in and gave me about 4,000 people in the south end. So my district was about 60% new when I ran for re-election the first time.
Goodness, that's a disadvantage, I think.
Well, and it was a tough district in that Salina is metropolitan enough. There's a lot of development outside the city. So you have a lot of rural people that live out there that aren't farmers. And then I had, all of a sudden, the district had about 18,000 people in it. And all of a sudden, here are 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 people that live right in town in the sort of upwardly mobile, you know, $70,000 home range. And then all these people over in Harrington that were Union Railroad. So I really, it's a difficult district to represent because when it came to urban-rural issues, you were split 50-50. You know, and you were always between the devil and the deep blue sea. Do you go with the ag people and have, you know, the city half mad, or do you go with the city people and have the ag half mad? So, and it was a difficult district in school finance measures because I had one large school district that took in about half of my people, and then I had parts of 10 small school districts.
My goodness.
And the way the school finance plan works, if it was good for the big one, which took in half the people in the district, it was bad for the rest of them. You know, it always works inversely, so you always kind of had to pick the plan that was the least bad for both types of districts. So it was kind of a tough
situation, Well, it's an unusual district, too, I think. Now, let's see, it was redistricted again then.
It was redistricted.
Just before this election.
Yes, just before this one. So, frankly, I mean, I was gearing up to run for re-election, and then this opportunity for change came along, and I'd done a lot of mailing back out in Ellsworth County again. You know, it was back there, but I was amazed at how many people had remembered me from 10 years ago.
For Pete's sake. Well, why did you decide to, that's one of the questions, why did you decide to do this instead of run again?
Oh,
you were appointed before your term was up and before the elections even. I can't remember.
Right. I found out about the 1st of May. I had gone in and talked to the governor about this, and really, it was just one of those opportunities. The the area that I had sort of carved out as my major area of interest and when I tried to develop expertise in the legislature was the tax area.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I'd always looked at that I always thought, I'd really like to be on is the State Board of Tax Appeals.
Oh.
And your chances of getting on that, of having a governor who will appoint you and their 4-year terms and an appointment expire. And of course, we're appointed by congressional districts, so you only have a chance of going for one slot, the one from your congressional district. And I always thought, well, it's one of those dreams I'd like to fulfill, but it'll never happen. I'll never be in the right place when that comes up and all that. And the legislature has reached the point where it's really a full-time job with part-time pay. And trying to juggle being at the farm and being in the legislature and being at everything, all the extra stuff people expect me to be at, I found, and going through reappraisal, being on the tax committee and active in that area, going through reappraisal, I reached the point in Salina where I'd walk into the grocery store and felt like I needed to say, Representative Aylward will be by the lettuce for the next 30 minutes to answer your reappraisal questions. So, and it's a community, even though all of the city of Salina wasn't in my district, when people had tax things, I think they called me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I ended up with my whole district plus these other 50,000 people that didn't live in it, so you just, it really kind of wore you out. And I've been there 12 years, which is longer than the average.
Yes, it is.
Well, then all of a sudden I discovered that Keith Farrar, who was my person on the Board of Tax Appeals, decided he wanted to retire.
Oh, for Pete's sake. Right at that time, wasn't it, too?
Right at that time. And I thought, gosh, that is absolutely the opportunity that I've been looking for. And I went in and talked to the governor, and he thought about it a while, and they called back and said, okay. And I said...
So you never really got into that election at all, or filed, or...
No, I didn't. I knew, in fact, before filing time came along. I was pretty certain during the veto session that it was going to work out. And as soon as I got home from the veto session, then they called and said, okay.
Well, you've mentioned the tax issues and education issues. What other issues were important in your district? Agricultural issues, I assume, too.
Agricultural issues were very important. Probably one of the biggest things that happened for my area was passage of the multi-year highway improvement plan.
Oh, yes.
Because 81 Highway, even though it turns into I-35 in my district, it is the link that leads us to the north, and right north of my district it switched into that really dangerous 2-lane. And that's going to be turned into a 4-lane under that plan. And in Saline County we have lots and lots of rivers. We got 3 rivers that go through there. And that's providing a lot of bridges out in the rural area that, being an agricultural community, those old bridges you couldn't get farm equipment across. So, that's real important to them. One thing that I got to start with a little bit before I left was the merger of Kansas College of Technology and K-State. And, that's a real plus. I was involved in getting that training program, that international training program for pilots there in Salina before I left, and we're training pilots from all over the world there now. So, those were some of the interesting things that we did.
Well, those are really important, too, for the communities, I would think, of employment and the number of people involved.
Oh, yeah, and I was vice chairman of the Economic Development Committee, and we did a number of things that helped attract some businesses, in our area. So.
Were there any of these issues, I can't think of any that we've talked about, that people would generally identify with women as women's issues? Did you feel like there were sort of some issues while you were in the House that were women's issues and women were expected to respond to them or carry them? Or
There were some, and there were some that my stance probably would surprise people on. Of course, the main one that comes to mind is that my last 2 years I was vice chairman of the Federal and State Affairs Committee when the abortion issue came up in front of us. And, that was one that women respond very vehemently on both sides. So, as a woman, that was a tough one for me, but I came down on the pro-choice side of that.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly one that women got interested in, though. One of the other issues I can think of would be the gender balance bills that we've dealt with over there to require women, equal numbers of women on all the boards and commissions and those sorts of things. And that was one that surprised a lot of people because I was one of the very few women who opposed that.
Mm.
And I really felt that I opposed that issue for a good reason. The fact is, I wouldn't want people out there to think I was appointed to the Board of Tax Appeals only because they needed a woman up here.
Yeah.
I want to know myself that I was appointed because I was the best choice that they had, not because, they had 3 men, so they had to put a woman on. And I really believe that women have made the strides to the point now where if they're qualified, they get those appointments.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you were going to describe yourself as a liberal or conservative on most issues, not just women's issues or the ones we've talked about, agricultural or education, but just across the board issues, how would you describe yourself?
I think how I describe myself, and probably because I tried to represent my district, and I think that was the attitude in my district, I'm sort of a moderate conservative. I am pretty conservative when it comes to spending money, and made a lot of people unhappy over the years when they'd walk in the office and say, we need money for this, and I'd say, fine, what tax do you want me to increase to get it for you, because we don't have the money and it's not there and I can't do it. And however, overall, I'm not a conservative who was right of Genghis Khan. There are conservatives that fall into that bracket, and I wasn't. I voted for the multi-year highway plan and the tax increases that went along to fund that. So, and voted for things like the margin of excellence that, it's not bare bones, but I felt that it was important to do those sorts of things. So I think maybe moderate conservative would be the best way to typify me.
That's good. As a freshman legislator, did you have any contacts or any person you would say was a mentor or someone that really kind of helped you get on the committees you wanted and find out how to do things and everything? Because you were younger than most of them and probably in a different situation than a lot of them did.
Yeah, I really was. And really, I think I was so young when I first came up here that almost everybody took me under their wing. So I had lots of mentors my first couple of years because I think they, I reminded so many of them of their daughter or some of them their granddaughters that they wanted to make sure that I got around okay. One of the people who really helped me when I first came up was Jerry Simpson, who was also a freshman legislator from Salina. And I think because he was from Salina, in fact, Wendell Lady was in speaker, and Wendell put Jerry and I in the same office together. They had put 3 legislators in one office, and Jerry and I were in the same office. And I'm sure, looking back on it, that was by design because he knew I'd be comfortable asking Jerry questions and that kind of thing. However, Jerry wasn't here too long.
Yeah.
He resigned to take a federal appointment with HUD. And then there was absolutely one individual who was my mentor, my best friend, my seatmate. My entire legislative career came in the same year I did. That was Rochelle Chronister. And Rochelle is someone who I've always admired and looked at the way she deals with things. And I know in a lot of ways tried to pattern the way I respond to things. Oh, and I smoked too much. Oh, that's on there. Take it off.
No, that I will. I don't. Some of them didn't look like. I think you mentioned some of the committees you served on, but let's get a summary of what committees you served on your first term and if they changed after that.
Oh gosh, you're asking me to go back to ancient history. My first term. Yeah, I had a number of committee changes while I served. My first term, I served on the Agriculture and Livestock Committee because I thought for my district that was important. And I served on the Federal and State Affairs Committee. And I believe I was on special claims against the state. I think I'm correct with that. Then my second term, I had the opportunity to serve as vice chairman of the Agriculture and Livestock Committee, which was an interesting time because, as you'll recall, that's when the Grain Marketing Compact was big and everybody was driving their tractor to Washington with the American Agricultural Movement and all that. So we had some pretty interesting meetings in ag and livestock back then, and served on federal and state affairs most of the time. I was in the legislature and became vice chairman of that eventually. When Mike Hayden was Speaker of the House, I chaired a committee that Mike established called Communications, Computers, and Technology, which was a really interesting committee for me. We were going through some mainframe computer acquisitions at the state level. I had very little background in computers, but you really didn't have to know how to use them. It was more an overall theory. We also got into a lot of work with cable television, public television, who should be able to sell and resell telecommunications services. So that was
interesting.
Chairing that committee for a couple of years was a real learning experience.
Now, does that committee still exist?
No, it doesn't. I was on it for 2 years, and then Mike made me chairman of it for 2 years. And then when Jim Braden came in as speaker, Jim determined that so much of the funding that we established also needed to be done by the Appropriations Committee.
Really?
And we had lost a number of Republicans, and we were spreading people awfully thin, so Jim abolished the committee after that. But I thought we did some real interesting work while we existed, and it sure taught me a lot. I served on the Tax Committee, I believe, for 8 years, and served on the Reapportionment Committee this last time. I knew what had happened to my district the first time they reapportioned it. I wasn't on the committee, so one of my number one requests was to be on the committee this time, and I was, and got to help draw the lines on my district this time. And let's see, one of the things when I first came in, I remember meeting with Wendell Lady, who was speaker, and I told him that I wanted federal and state affairs because it sounded interesting, and you got such a menagerie of things in that committee. You know, you had betting and all the liquor bills, and of course we were still not a liquor by the drink state at that time, and we had everything that kind of came in from every direction ended up in that committee, so it was pretty exciting. But I remember talking to Wendell about what other committees I'd want to serve on, and he said, well, you know, some of the people like to serve on public health and welfare. And I said, the last thing you will ever do is put me on public health and welfare. I can promise you that. I don't want to be there. So I never did do that. I served on the Rules and Regulations Committee, which was an experience. About 3 days before your committee meeting every month, the UPS driver would pull up and bring you a package of proposed rules and regulations that probably weighed 20 pounds.
Good. Nice.
It'd be a stack, oftentimes 10 inches high, that you were going to go through at your next set of committee meetings. So that was an interesting committee to serve on. But without question, my favorite one was tax.
Was it? Well,
absolutely.
And when did you start serving on the tax? That wasn't your first term then?
No, I didn't get on it right away because Jerry Simpson came up at the same time I did, and he'd had so much more experience. Jerry got the tax committee, but then when Jerry went out, I got Jerry's slot, and I think that was about 1981.
So you were early. Yeah, well, that's a good experience, yeah.
And they wouldn't put two people from slot on the tax committee.
Now, did you hold any other leadership positions besides the committee chairman and vice chairman?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
No, I did have an opportunity, though, because of
Wanda, please dial your extension. Wanda.
my committee chairmanships and vice chairmanships to be on our National Conference of State Legislators group, and I served on a couple of those where I go to meetings lots of places, either on telecommunications, and later on I served on the transportation committee for that.
And there were several different leaders of the House during your 12 years there. Can you describe that power structure in any, kind of briefly anyway? How did it change and what was it? And I guess the different people made a difference.
Oh, yes, I remember the first year that I came in, there was a bloody battle for Speaker of the House between Carlos Cooper and Wendell Lady. And of course Wendell ultimately won that. And one thing that I was really fortunate with the entire time I was there, and some of it probably was intuition or good judgment, but I'd have to credit some of it to just blind luck. I always voted for the right person, so that always helped with your committee assignments or I voted for the person who won. And they did have different leadership styles. And they had to have different leadership styles because the people in the legislature changed dramatically during just the 12 years that I was there. You're dealing with a whole different kind of people and a different attitude today than you were when Wendell was Speaker. I think probably the most hard-line, strongest leadership I saw was under Mike Hayden. Mike would line people up and say, all right, we need this passed, this is going to be Republican, and who can't vote for it? And I remember a few times I was dumb enough to stick my arm up and say I can't, and I'd end up back in the Speaker's office and we'd discuss whether I really couldn't vote for it or not. But, ultimately if Mike Hayden believed you really couldn't, for political or philosophical or whatever reasons you had, he'd say, okay, we'll find somebody else to take your place. But Mike also had an advantage in that Republicans had a larger majority then,
that's right.
and he had more people that he could let off the hook. Jim Braden probably was the most patient leader I've ever met in my life because we had the group of House rebels evolve who purported themselves to be conservatives, but we kept a tally of their spending and they outspent me about 2-1 on everything. And, honestly, how he kept his sanity and even attempted to run the House into those conditions when you're being blamed for being in the majority, but you don't have 63 votes. And nobody could have done that. Nobody could have done it. And I really enjoyed Mike's leadership as Speaker, too.
That's interesting. Well, you talk about the rebels. Were there any, and you weren't a rebel, let's make that clear, but were there any groups or coalitions that you did participate in? I remember last year reading in the newspaper about a women's coalition. Now, whether that was the newspaper's name for it or, the women in the House, I don't know. Did you participate in any kind of informal or formal groups like that?
No, not really. I did participate in some groups. For example, when different people were majority leader or whatever. They'd kind of establish a group that would go off and have dinner or get pizza one night a week. And you kind of served in their cabinet where you'd say, well, this is what I'm hearing, or I can talk to these people, So I belonged to some of those kinds of things. I remember when we had a majority leader one time that liked to have meetings at 6:30 in the morning. And getting up early has never bothered me. Being somewhere at 6:30 in the morning was early, but I always made those too. And those were, those gave you a real feeling of being able to have some influence on what direction the House went in. As far as the group that evolved last year, the women's group, I think they were tabbed the Steel Magnolias or something after that movie. I think there were 3 women in the House who didn't participate, and I was one of them. Because I understood what they were doing in trying to prove a point, and essentially what they were trying to prove, and it's something that I said over and over and over, is if this group of men here are going to pass more restrictive abortion laws, they better be ready to put their money where their mouth is and provide more money for foster care and those sorts of things. I believe they're absolutely right. I also knew we didn't have the money to spend, and I thought, what I'm going to do is fight the more restrictive laws on this side and not overspend here, and that was the decision that I made.
That's interesting. Can you identify 3 or 4 maybe major issues, debates, controversies, or victories, or things that happened that stand out in your mind that fall into any of those categories? Memories you have of things that you did or were part of?
Oh, there are a number. The first one, of course, everybody remembers the first bill they carried.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember the first time I went down to the well with the bill, and I was holding it in my hand, and I thought, I'm shaking so much. People clear back there in the back of the gallery are going to be able to see this. Real simple little bill that came out of Federal and State Affairs Committee. Neil Whitaker was chairman at the time. And I walked down there with this simple little bill. Didn't do much of anything because that's what they give you for your first bill. And they did to me what they do to everybody. You have the white lights up there, people want to speak, and I said, Mr. Chairman, are there any questions? And I turned around and every light on the board was lit up. And then, eventually people started shutting theirs off and there weren't any questions, but one question remained, and another woman legislator came down and was carrying an amendment to ban massage parlors because there was a real problem with massage parlors in her district. And in my 22 years of experience, I had no clue in the world as to what a massage parlor was. And I remember going over to my chairman and saying, Neil, what do I do? And he said, Janie, just keep your mouth shut and let her put it on. We'll take it off in conference committee. And I said, fine. I later learned what a massage parlor was. And probably would have been more embarrassed had I known at the time. I didn't know what I had. There were a number of others. When I was chairman of the Communications, Computers, and Technology Committee, and it's one of the few bills I'll remember the number on, Senate Bill 226, was one that dealt with resale of telecommunications services. And that was a bill I worked on very, very hard. Very controversial matter, and took a lot of debate on the floor of the House. And I remember I got it through the House, squeaked through the Senate, I think, with 1 vote, and then John Carlin vetoed it. And I had spent 2 years on that bill. So I'll never forget Senate Bill 226. That'll be one that remains in my mind forever. And the other ones that stand out to me, probably a more recent memory, are the tax bills that we had last year. I ended up as chairman of the subcommittee on the bill that would have closed all the sales tax exemptions, a bill that I was opposed to. It was Joan Wagner, the ranking minority member on tax, had the bill, and she was another member on the subcommittee. There were 3 of us, and the third member wasn't real interested, so Joan and I ended up having most of the hearings. But we had full-blown hearings on that, really worked through it, and ended up with a proposal, which I still told Joan, I said, I don't think I can still support this. It's not my idea, but I'm trying to do for you the best I can to get something out there. And we ended up putting together something that proposed, in fact, it was my idea, I'll take credit for that, sales tax on services. Oh. And it's amazing, it's come back around in the governor's message this year. So, it's kind of fun this year to sit back and say, well, I know exactly how much that one raises, how much, and I know what closing that exemption's going to do. So we went through a lot of debate on those issues. There was another one that dealt with the reappraisal moratorium last year that I carried on the floor, I think, 3 times and finally got passed. So, I suppose those stand out more because they're recent memories, but those are ones that...
They were big too, though.
And I had an opportunity to carry the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights a couple of years ago, and that was kind of an interesting bill to have. So I'm sure that there are more, I'd have to think.
Yeah, you probably at different times remember different things. When you started in the House, there were, how many women? I was trying to remember. There weren't very many.
I think there were 7 when I came in, 7 or 9. And a number of us came in
at the same
time.
That's what
I think perhaps there were, Barbara, I don't remember.
Okay, I can probably look that up, but you're real close there. How many were in when you retired?
And I'd have to go back.
I think it was
count.
33.
That makes sense. Yeah. That sounds about right.
So you saw a huge increase in the number of women. Do you think that made a difference, having more women? in the House? You probably, of all the people there, you may have a better idea of that since you were there during the years that the increase occurred.
I don't know. Yes, the legislature has changed tremendously. And the attitudes and the way people deal with issues over there has changed tremendously. I don't know whether to attribute 0% or 50% or 80% of that to the fact that a greater percentage are women.
Mm-hmm. But there might be some influence, you think?
I think, there could be some influence. Very frankly, in the legislature, and, you have to understand, you're talking to someone who's an animal science graduate who farms, so I'm used to dealing with men a lot. In the legislature, I never felt like people noticed, what gender you were as long as you were there and did your work. Perhaps having more women there put more concentration on some of the social issues, but I don't necessarily know that that's true. Because some of the biggest proponents of the social issues were men.
That's interesting. It's important, in fact. Okay, we've kind of talked mainly now about your terms in the legislature. I'll talk about you a little bit personally. Are you a native of Kansas? I think you've already told me you were.
Yes, I am. In fact, my mother's grandfather, we have long generations in our family, my great-grandfather was the first settler in Sling County. He settled there in 1856, which was 100 years before I was born. His brother was scalped by the Indians, and they left. But he lived. And then they came back in 1857 and settled. So he doesn't get all the credit for being the first settler because they had to leave because his brother got scalped. But he's...
Well, did your family then farm that same farm? Is this where you grew up then?
I grew up on some of the land that he homesteaded back then. He ran a ferry across the Sling River and ferried people across, but he accumulated a lot of land. And we still farm part of it. There are all kinds of stories. Salina is about 13 miles from Solomon, and they say that you used to, now you have to zigzag back and forth a little bit, but you used to be able to walk from Salina to Solomon without ever getting off Grandpa Schippel's land.
Oh my goodness.
I don't know if that's true or not. But,
what was his name?
Schippel.
Schippel. How do you spell that?
Schippel.
Okay.
Goddard Schippel.
I read the name before too. Well, you grew up then there and went to school there all the way through.
Yes.
Can you describe your early education experience? Was it out
Well,
the country,
it's a little different for somebody. I'm 34 now. Somebody my age. We lived there on a section that Grandpa Schippel homesteaded, about half a mile away from the old house. He had a house down there and a grain elevator and all that. Somebody burned it down on us a few years ago. But there was wallpaper in it from the 1901 World's Fair. It had gotten dilapidated. Nobody lived in it for years. But anyway, I grew up not too far from that, and I started out in school in a one-room school that sat down on the same quarter that our house was on. So I used to walk across the field to school every day, and I had the largest class in the school. There were 3. My older sister was the only one in her class, and it was just a basic one-room school, and they had the old Board of Education with the holes drilled in it. If somebody went behind the piano with the Board of Education, they'd really done something wrong. And our major entertainment over the noon hour was to go down in the basement because there were cracks in the cement basement, and we could get ringneck snakes and play with them. So I started out there, and it closed when I was in the 4th grade. But in the 3rd grade, my parents decided we probably really weren't getting the best education that was available. Not that the teachers weren't good, but, education had just progressed. So they moved us in. We're Catholic. And they moved us up to a parochial school. So I went to Sacred Heart all the way through high school. And then they adopted a modular system when I was in high school so that you could take the classes and finish them early. So really, my senior year, I had American Government and Band were the only classes I needed to take. So then I went out to Marymount College and got a lot of credits my senior year.
My goodness.
and then transferred up to K-State
Oh.
and majored in animal science up there and graduated in 4 years up there. And then ran for the legislature.
So that's what you've done. Well, that's
Pretty concise life.
Yeah, that's interesting. Early education, particularly. Your parents farmed. Now, did your mother have work outside the home? Or?
No, before they got married, my mother's a college graduate. She graduated from Loretta Heights out in Denver.
Oh.
And she did work as a social worker before they were married, but after they got married, she's been a homemaker, but she doesn't work outside of the home, but she does work outside of the home when it comes to hauling Milo, when it comes to helping somebody round up cattle and drive the pickup. She does all that. The one place that she drew the line is that she absolutely refuses ever to learn how to drive a tractor because then she will have to.
Yeah.
But
did you drive a tractor?
Busy. Oh, I ran a tractor a lot.
Yeah.
In fact, even down here, I took a week off during harvest time and went out. We've got an 8630 John Deere, big 4-wheel drive. And I love it. I can go out and put my jeans and boots on and get on that thing. The phone doesn't ring. Nobody bothers you. I can listen to the radio all day and work ground, and I love it. And I spent a lot of weekends doing that.
That's interesting. But your mother didn't do that.
No, not the tractor, but she can run about everything else.
Yeah, that's interesting. Did you belong, or have you belonged at any time in your life to any organizations that you think contributed some of the maybe inspiration or ideas or skills necessary for you being in the legislature?
Absolutely. In fact, one organization I credit a great deal with me being in the legislature today is 4-H. I started out as a 4-H'er when I was 8 years old. And, of course, my big deal was to show cattle. I loved to show cattle, and in fact showed them on the circuit, some for, open class breeders. But 4-H, the other thing that my mother insisted on when I was in 4-H is that I always give talks and speeches and participate in County 4-H Day. And when I went to Sacred Heart to school, we didn't really have debate or forensics or anything like that. So the only public speaking training I ever had was 4-H.
Oh, for goodness sake.
And I was an ambassador in 4-H when I was in college and all. I mean, I was in 4-H until they threw me out and said, "You're too old to be in 4-H anymore. You can't do this anymore." But I did an awful lot of public speaking in 4-H and fortunately did real well and learned how to do demonstrations and come up with creative ideas for that sort of thing. And in fact, when I went to K-State, everybody has to take a 3-hour class in oral communications. And I found out that they had a quiz out in that. And I went in and they let you draw out of a hat and you get 3 topics and then you can narrow it down to the one of those 3 that you want to give a speech on. And I think they give you an hour to sit down and prepare a speech. And I did that and got a B and said, "That's good enough. I don't have to go to class all session or all semester." And
based on 4-H though.
And that's the only place I ever had that experience.
That's great. That's real. You're the first one that has mentioned 4-H, but I think that's interesting.
Oh, I absolutely wouldn't trade that background for anything. And I was club president. You learn. I worked from being a reporter, and you learned how to write things. And that was real helpful when it came to my newsletters that I was writing. And in fact, I was on the House floor one day. I can't remember what representative it was. It was Democrat. Came over and handed me something that he had found in an old 4-H journal. I'd sent it into the state 4-H journal. And it was written by Jayne Aylward, reporter for the Willing Workers 4-H Club. It was an article that I'd written probably, 15 or 20 years ago.
And he found it in his research or something?
Somewhere he came across this old 4-H journal and cut it out. And I think it was something that I'd written maybe in 1972 or 71. But, I learned about leadership and I got to be on County 4-H Council, and that's good training.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, you lived in Topeka just during the session, and you didn't try to commute back and forth at all?
No, it's too far from Salinas.
You said you went back once to work the fields or plant or something. You mentioned.
Oh, that's since I've been on the
that's since you've been here. Okay.
No, when I was in the legislature, that was my other job, and I'd get up every morning, put my jeans and boots on, and go out to the farm and do whatever it was. The cattle are my favorite part.
Are they?
You have to do the other stuff. my out.
Yeah, we all do us. It's so hard to sit here and not respond back to you, and then all this that I say, they to leave me out. You have to. It's a conversation, even though it doesn't look like it on paper. I was going to ask you a little bit more about what helped, hindered, or shaped this ability. Now, you've mentioned 4-H. Can you think of anything within your family, or you talk a lot about your father in his service, maybe his community service. Do you think there was anything there that influenced you that you haven't mentioned, maybe?
Oh, Barbara, I had so much support in my family for anything that I wanted to do. I always knew with my parents, whatever I decided to do was okay with them. But they're the kind of parents that you wanted to please. So I always felt like I do things because I want them to be happy about things that I did. And, I think that's reflected in my brother and sister, too. My brother was real involved in all kinds of stuff. And, they're just, they were the kind of family that if it required some extra effort on their part, well, an example is the school bus for the public school drove right by our house. My mother would put us in the car and drive us to parochial school every day. They always made that extra effort to do what they thought needed to be done for you. And I can never think of a thing that I got involved in or that I volunteered my mother for, and I was great at volunteering my mother for things that they'd say no to. So I think just the overall support. I really grew up following my father around. In fact, they laugh at me up here because I walk so fast. They say, well, Janie, we can always tell us when you coming down the hallway because you walk so fast. I was so thrilled when they carpeted this and you couldn't really walk. But I really grew up kind of following my dad around. And my dad is a perfectionist, absolute, positive perfectionist. And I think I learned a lot of that from him, although you couldn't tell it from looking at my desk right now. But, I think we're very thorough in everything that we do. And if we decide we're going to get into something, we're going to do it to the very best of our ability. And that's a trait that I learned from my father and my mother.
No, that's great. Well, do you think your service in the legislature affected or changed you in any way, or the way people treat you? Or I'm sure 12 years at your age and everything, that must have been very influential.
Oh, it definitely was. In fact, for me, it's hard to tell you how it affected me because that's how my adult life's always been. I don't know what adult life not being in the legislature would have been like because I didn't live it. I tumbled straight out of college into this. So I know that there's no question that it did. Otherwise, I don't know. I don't know where I'd be today if I hadn't run for the legislature. Who knows? I could be off in some other city working somewhere. I might be out on the farm running a bigger cow herd. There's no question but that my farming interests didn't grow more because of my involvement in the legislature. But, it's so nice to go home to Salina and you walk down the street and every other person you see will say, well, hi, Janie, and you know everybody. And I do have to say, when I made the transition from the legislature to the Board of Tax Appeals, this is a very responsible position, not as visible. And I'm living year-round in a town where you don't know everybody. It was a real transition for me because I was so accustomed to being, Representative Jayne Aylward. And I really don't think I ever got arrogant about that. I don't think there's any reason to because you're at the mercy of all those people out there all the time. But, there's a certain stigma that's attached to that. And all of a sudden you turn around one day and you're not. And you go to the grocery store and nobody knows you. In fact, as much as I griped about all the multitudes of phone calls during reappraisal, because I'd go out and work on the farm 12 hours and come home, crawl in the shower about 9 o'clock, and I'd look over at the answering machine, and the light would be flashing
Uh-huh.
20 times, and I think, how can I ever do all this? But when I made the transition and moved up here and discovered I'm in a quasi-judicial position, I can't talk to people about their cases. You know, I have to have our attorneys talk to people about their cases because I'm making the judgments. And all of a sudden I started going home at night, and I go to the store and I wouldn't know anybody. I'd walk in and not a call had come in on the answering machine.
What a switch, yeah.
And it really was a switch for me. You know, now I'm getting to know people. And frankly, you know, in the last couple of weeks, the legislature's back down,
Yeah.
so I'm getting to see lots of
Yeah.
old friends now. But I'm beginning to learn what life like a real person's like.
Yeah. So instead of it affecting you, your change back has affected you probably more than, well, I mean, it was more of an adjustment than going into the legislature.
Yeah, because honestly, when I went in, I was like a lot of people of a lot of ages that get elected to the legislature. You know, you're elected and you say, now what do I do? And I just kind of grew up in that.
Oh, that's really great. How do you think your being in the legislature affected your family?
I think it had a pretty major impact on my family. You know, like I say, they had been involved in the farming community around there and lots of things. So, you know, they knew people throughout the community. But I remember my mother making the comment several years ago that she had made the transition from being Norma Aylward to being Jayne Aylward's mother. Everywhere she went, she was, oh, you're Jayne Aylward's mother. So I think that had an impact on it had a major impact on my brother because he met his wife through me. So I think that had a big impact, and it was because I had met her mother through Republican politics. So I think that, and I know it did have a big impact on and now my sister's son, my nephew, has decided he wants to be a tax attorney, and I think they may have something to do with what I'm doing now.
Yes, sounds like
so it's put my family more in the spotlight than they would have been.
And you know, there was no one from your family that you know of that was in the House or Senate before you.
Only that uncle that I mentioned earlier in this interview. But then the other impact that it had, of course, when I came on the board, I had to resign. I'd been through both sessions, but, you know, there was an unexpired term to be filled. So now my father's been a state representative. The precinct committee people elected him to fulfill my unexpired term.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes, so now my father is a former state representative. And I really worked on him to run for that seat. I just know he'd have been elected had he run.
He didn't run. He just
No, well, we have cows, and our heifers will start calving any day now, so.
I see. So
He decided that he needed to stay and do that, but it had that impact. And I know I could have never gotten elected without my family and my father and mother's reputation.
Now, you mentioned the uncle. What was your uncle's name?
Joe Crowther.
Okay. I don't remember whether you mentioned his name.
And he was there just a very short time, and frankly, it was when I was either a very small child or before I was born.
So you had no real close contact with him?
No. No, I've talked to him a few times since then. They live in Newport Beach, California now, and I'll call and he'll reminisce about the legislature with me.
Do you think that during these 12 years would be important to measure that the women being in the legislature and the expectations that there'll be more women and more women, do you think that's changed, and why? Why have women gotten into the legislature, been elected? Can you put your finger on anything that's happened that caused this? Or
I think there are a variety of reasons, and some are good reasons, some are kind of sad reasons. A big piece of it is the fact that more women are getting out and doing more, and it's accepted for them to do more. I think that's a pretty obvious reason. And, you know, women are involved in more local government kinds of things, and they tend to move their way up. They've sort of made the transition from being the cookie bakers that, you know, bring the refreshments to being the ones who are making the policy decisions. And the general public is more amenable
Mm-hmm.
to women making policy decisions. And in fact, over half the voting population are of the female gender, so they're going to elect more women, I believe. And I think those are all very good, solid, substantial reasons for having more women. As I mentioned earlier, I was on the National Conference of State Legislatures and had an opportunity to attend a lot of national meetings and talk to other men and women legislators from other states. Kansas, the last time I saw the statistics, I think ranked about 14th in the percentage of women in the legislature. We were very high in our percentage. And really in analyzing that, I think some of the bad reasons in why that's occurred is because, particularly through the new federalism, the states have been handed back so much responsibility. The legislature is full-time. There's no question about the fact that you've got a full-time job there. But it doesn't pay much. So you tend to get retired people running, where it's a second income, or you get the second income earner in the household running, because it's a second income. It's not a bad second income, but it has reached the point where you don't have the candidates out there who are the primary breadwinner because they can't take the time away from their business to do it.
Interesting.
And women can take the time away a little better, and the public's beginning to accept women with younger children coming up here. They don't believe that that's a desertion issue like they would have 10 years ago. So I think that really is one of the reasons. When you look at the national numbers, and you can analyze this yourself, but the states that consider their legislatures full-time, like California, don't have as high a percentage of women that I've seen.
Well, that's very interesting. I'm going to look that up, yes.
The states that have legislatures that meet as long as we do, because people think we come down here for 90 days. That is so untrue. I spent half of my time when we were out of session, without question, doing legislative stuff.
Yes.
Attending meetings or answering mail or answering phone calls. Without question, I'd spend 4 hours a day, 5 hours a day doing that when we weren't in session. And not all legislators have to do that in my district. I felt like I needed to. But I think a lot of it is because it simply is, unless the primary breadwinner is in a unique kind of job where in one way or another it would help their reputation to be a legislator, or in such a high managerial position that they can get away and turn it over to somebody else while they're gone and have, other people take care of their mail. They simply can't afford to do it anymore. And I think if you look at the demographics of the candidates, it shows.
Very interesting. Very probably the reason. I mean, that's very logical.
Well, and more women also are running because more women are getting recruited, because you can take, and I don't know why society votes this way, but you can take a 50-year-old man and put a 35 or 40-year-old woman against him, and 9 times out of 10 she's going to win.
They don't get defeated very often.
Parties recruit candidates who will win, and that's who they recruit.
Well, that's interesting. Why they win is an interesting issue, too.
And I don't understand, aside from the fact that if you take a 50-year-old man, he's probably the primary breadwinner, and he can't take time away from work to put on the kind of campaign that a 40-year-old woman who is a homemaker, who for a short term, decides maybe the kids can spend a little more time with the babysitter. And I don't know whether there are other reasons than that. I'm sure that there are, but I don't know.
That sounds like a real good theory. I mean, I think it.
But if you look at the demographics over there now, you've got semi-retired people, you've got lots of women, you've got a few primary breadwinner kind of men who, in one way or another, it's beneficial to the business to be there. And then you've got some real young people like I was when I came in.
Were you the youngest at that point when you were elected?
Well, I think, and I haven't ever researched it, but I was told at one time that I'm the youngest woman that's ever been elected in Kansas. I don't know that for a fact. I would have been the youngest person to come in, except the year I was elected, a young man from Wichita was elected that was 19 years old. And I don't think anyone as young as he or I have been elected since then, but it just so happened we both
Well,
came in that year.
Was that the year we changed the voting age? Yeah.
No, because I'd voted in an election before that, and otherwise I wouldn't have been able to vote before that. So it would have been a couple of years after that. But he ran and I think got real frustrated, you know, with the process. I don't know what all his reasons were. But anyway, he didn't ever run again.
He just ran that one term? That's probably why I can't even remember who it was, or...
John Sullivan.
Or don't remember.
And as I understand it, he's an FBI agent in Washington, D.C. now. But I think he got married and had a family to take care of and decided it really would be a good decision to go on and
Well, at
form a
19,
career.
he was just out of high school.
Or in college. I
In
think.
college.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything I haven't asked you about that you would like to talk about? I always try to end with this because maybe I didn't ask the right questions to kind of fit your situation.
Oh, I don't know, Barbara. We've discussed so much. I just, really when you ask me questions about the legislature, it's not asking me about a piece of my life. It's really asking me about my life as I remember it. My life would be so totally different if I hadn't ever been there. Who knows, I may have progressed a great deal more in my career and be off somewhere in corporatedom somewhere if I hadn't done it. But on the flip side, it's an experience that I would never trade for anything in the world. And, you know, some days I get a little melancholy about it and start missing it, and I think, well, heavens to Betsy, Janie. You're 34 years old. Nobody says you can't go back.
Yeah.
You could go back 20 years from now, and I might.
Yeah.
Or sooner. You know, who knows? But, you know, it would be fun to go back at some point knowing what I know and move into leadership in the legislature, and that may be a goal that I set.
Or a state office, even, if you've ever considered something.
You know, and those are always options that are open. The fact is, I love politics. If it hadn't been, I love government. I love good government. I get tired of the flailing. I've been disappointed and disenchanted with the success of negative campaigns in the past few years. But, you know, all in all, it's an experience I wouldn't trade for anything in the world.
One of these days, I'll probably have to interview him, too.
You may have to.